Alright, this happened to me a few years ago when I was living on my own for the first time. I had just moved into this small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one bedroom place in a relatively quiet neighborhood. I was excited about having my own space, you know? No roommates, no parents, just me doing my own thing. It was my first real taste of independence. The building was kind of old though. The floors creaked, the walls were thin, and you could hear pretty much everything that was going on in the hallway. My neighbors kept to themselves for the most part, which was fine by me. I didn't mind the quiet, so one night I was home alone, just chilling in my living room. It was a Friday, and I had decided to stay in, make some dinner, and watch a movie. I remember it was around 8 p.m. I had my favorite show on, and I was all set for a relaxing evening. My phone was on the coffee table, and I was just zoning out, enjoying my night. Then I heard a noise. It was faint, just a little creak coming from the kitchen. At first I thought it was nothing, just the building settling or something. Old places make weird noises all the time, right? So I ignored it and kept watching my show. But then I heard it again, this time a little louder. It sounded like something tapping, almost like fingernails on a hard surface. Now, I'm not one to get spooked easily, but being alone in an old apartment can mess with your head. I muted the TV and listened. For a second, everything was quiet. I started to relax again, thinking I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again, a definite tapping sound coming from the kitchen. I got up and walked over to the kitchen. It was just a few steps from the living room. It was a small apartment after all. The lights were on and everything looked normal. My heart was beating a little faster, but I tried to brush it off. I did a quick scan of the room. The sink was empty, the counter was clear, and the fridge was humming away like usual. Nothing seemed out of place. I even opened the cabinets, thinking maybe something had fallen inside, but they were all empty. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the tapping sound had stopped. I shook my head, laughing at myself for getting freaked out over nothing, and went back to the living room. I sat back down on the couch and turned the TV back on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone standing in the kitchen doorway, but there was nothing. About half an hour later, I started to relax again. The noise hadn't come back, and I was getting into my show, trying to forget about the weirdness from earlier. That's when I heard it again. This time it wasn't just a tap, it was more like a shuffle, like something moving across the kitchen floor. It was faint, but it was definitely there. I muted the TV again and listened, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the direction of the kitchen, but I couldn't see anything from where I was sitting. I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It sounded like footsteps, but slow and shuffling, like someone was dragging their feet. I told myself it was probably just the neighbors. Maybe they were moving something heavy, and the sound was carrying through the walls. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The noise was too close, too clear. I stood up, grabbed my phone, and slowly made my way to the kitchen. As I approached, the sound stopped. I hesitated at the doorway, peering into the room. It looked exactly the same as before, empty and still. I stepped inside, my pulse racing. I walked over to the fridge and opened it, even though I knew that didn't make any sense. It was full of food, nothing unusual. I checked the cabinets again, then the pantry. Nothing. I was about to head back to the living room when I heard it again, right behind me. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just empty air and the cold light from the kitchen bulb. Now I was officially freaked out. I grabbed my phone and texted a friend, just to have someone to talk to and keep my mind off whatever was happening. I didn't want to sound like a paranoid idiot, so I just said, "Hey, can we chat for a bit? I'm feeling kind of weird being alone right now." My friend replied almost instantly, and we started texting back and forth. It helped a little, just having a distraction. I went back to the living room, trying to calm down and convince myself it was all in my head. About an hour went by without any more weird noises, and I started to think maybe I was just being paranoid after all. I decided to get ready for bed. I turned off the TV, grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen, and headed to my bedroom. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was coming from my bedroom. I froze, my toothbrush still in my mouth. The sound was soft but unmistakable, like something brushing against the wall or the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I stood there in the bathroom, staring at the closed bedroom door, trying to convince myself I was hearing things. But then it happened again. A soft, dragging noise, like fabric sliding across the floor. I turned off the bathroom light and crept toward the bedroom door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. I took a deep breath and opened it slowly, peeking inside. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside my window. I stepped inside, squinting to see in the dim light. The noise had stopped again, and everything looked normal. Bed neatly made, clothes piled on the chair, nothing out of place. I walked over to the bed, my heart racing, and checked underneath. Nothing. I looked in the closet, behind the curtains. Anywhere something could be hiding. But there was nothing. I tried to shake off the fear and told myself I was just being stupid. There was nothing here. I was alone, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. I grabbed my phone and started texting my friend again, trying to distract myself. But even as I typed, I couldn't stop glancing at the bedroom door, half expecting it to move. After a while, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the middle of the night. The room was pitch black, and I couldn't see a thing. I reached for my phone to check the time. It was 3:17 a.m. And then, I heard it again. But this time, it was right next to me. I froze, my eyes wide open in the dark. The sound was so close I could almost feel it, like something brushing against the side of my bed, just inches away from my face. It was a soft, whispery noise, like fabric moving against the floor. I didn't dare move. I lay there, holding my breath, listening to the sound, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to reach for the lamp on the bedside table, but I was too scared to move. The noise got louder, a slow, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. It couldn't be real. There was nothing there. I was alone. But then I felt it, a soft, gentle tug on the blanket. I gasped and sat up, fumbling for the light. My fingers found the switch, and I flicked it on, flooding the room with light. There was nothing there. The room was empty, just like before. I sat there, breathing hard, my eyes darting around the room. The blanket was still tucked around me, and everything looked normal. But I knew what I had felt. Something had tugged on the blanket. Something had been in the room with me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there with the light on, clutching my phone and staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. It was just silence. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, I packed a bag and left. I called my parents and told them I was coming over for a few days, just to get away. I didn't tell them what had happened. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. I just needed to get out of that apartment. I stayed at my parents' place for a while, trying to make sense of what had happened. I even went back to the apartment during the day to grab more of my stuff, but I never stayed there alone at night again. I ended up breaking my lease early and moving out. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was all in my head or if there really was something in the apartment with me, but I can tell you one thing. I'll never forget that feeling, lying in the dark, knowing something was there but not being able to see it. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you, makes you question your sanity and your sense of safety. Now, whenever I'm home alone, I can't help but remember that night. I listen for the sounds, the soft taps and shuffles, and I keep the lights on just in case. Because sometimes, even when you think you're alone, you're not. I remember this night pretty vividly. It was about a year ago, and my parents were out of town for the weekend, leaving me home alone. I was used to it by then, being in my early 20s and having the house to myself from time to time. Usually it was just an excuse to binge watch Netflix, order some takeout, and maybe invite a couple of friends over. But this time, I decided to just chill on my own. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a quiet night to myself. The day had been pretty normal. I went about my usual Saturday routine, ran a few errands, picked up some groceries, and even cleaned up the place a bit. By the evening, I was feeling pretty good, ready to just kick back and relax. I made some pasta for dinner, grabbed a glass of wine, and settled in on the couch to catch up on some TV shows. It was a little after 9 p.m., and the neighborhood was already quiet, as it usually was on weekends. I was about 3 episodes deep into my show when I heard the first noise. It was faint, almost like a tapping sound coming from somewhere in the house. At first, I thought it was just something outside, maybe a branch tapping against the window or the house settling. You know how it is when you're alone. Every little sound seems to get amplified. So I brushed it off and kept watching. But then, a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, like a knock. Not on the front door, but it sounded like it came from inside the house, maybe from the back or even upstairs. I paused the TV and listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just the usual hum of the fridge and the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen. I started to feel a bit uneasy. I mean, it was probably nothing, but you know how your mind can play tricks on you when you're home alone. I got up from the couch and walked around the living room, trying to figure out where the noise had come from. I checked the front door. It was locked. Then I walked over to the windows and peeked outside. Everything looked normal. The street was empty, and all the houses around were dark. After a few minutes of not hearing anything else, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, or maybe something settling in the house. I went back to the couch, trying to get back into my show, but it was hard to shake off the feeling that something was off. About half an hour later, it happened again. This time, it was louder and definitely coming from upstairs. It was a series of knocks, followed by a creaking sound, like someone walking on the floor above me. My heart skipped a beat, and I muted the TV, straining to hear more. I was sure I was alone in the house. My parents weren't coming back until Monday, and I hadn't invited anyone over. I sat there, frozen, trying to listen. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor upstairs. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was someone up there? Had someone broken in without me noticing? I grabbed my phone and started to dial 911, but then I hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if I was just freaking out over some normal house noises? I mean, it was an old house, and it made noises sometimes. But then again, this didn't feel like the usual creaks and groans of an old building. I decided to check it out. I grabbed a kitchen knife, yeah, I know, cliche, but it made me feel a little safer, and started making my way up the stairs. The house was dark, except for the light from the TV downstairs, and the faint glow from the streetlights outside filtering through the windows. Every step I took up the stairs seemed to echo through the silence, and I felt like I was holding my breath the entire time. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stood there for a moment, listening. The creaking had stopped, and everything was dead silent again. I felt my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I moved slowly down the hallway toward the bedrooms. I checked my parents' room first. It was empty, just the bed neatly made and everything in its place. Then I checked the bathroom and the guest room. Nothing. Finally, I got to my room at the end of the hall. I hesitated for a second before opening the door. The room was dark, but I could make out the shapes of my bed, my desk, and the piles of clothes I'd left on the chair. I stepped inside and flicked on the light. Nothing seemed out of place. No sign of anyone. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a bit ridiculous for scaring myself like that. I checked the windows to make sure they were locked, and then headed back downstairs. Maybe it really had just been the house settling or something outside that I'd misheard. I put the knife back in the kitchen drawer and went back to the living room, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I turned the TV back on, but I kept the volume low so I could hear if anything else happened. For the next hour or so, everything was quiet. I started to relax a little, convincing myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But then, just when I was starting to feel normal again, I heard it. The faint sound of a door creaking open upstairs. This time, it wasn't the random creaking of the floor or a knock. It was the unmistakable sound of a door opening, slowly and deliberately. I froze, my eyes glued to the ceiling. My brain was screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't move. I sat there, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard footsteps, slow, careful footsteps, moving across the floor above me. I grabbed my phone again, ready to call the cops this time. I couldn't explain it away as just the house making noises. Someone was up there. Someone was in the house. I dialed 911 and whispered to the operator, telling them I thought there was an intruder in my home. They told me to stay on the line and that they were sending someone over right away. They asked me to stay calm and to find a safe place to hide until help arrived. I didn't know where to go. My first instinct was to get out of the house, but I was afraid of running into whoever was upstairs. I decided to hide in the kitchen pantry. It wasn't much, but it was the only place I could think of where I could close the door and stay out of sight. I crept into the kitchen as quietly as I could, trying not to make any noise. I opened the pantry door and slipped inside, closing it behind me. It was cramped and dark, but I could still hear the operator's voice on the phone, telling me to stay calm and that the police were on their way. I listened to the sounds in the house, straining to hear any sign of movement. The footsteps were still upstairs, moving slowly from room to room. I could hear doors opening and closing, like they were searching for something or someone. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there in the dark, clutching my phone. The operator kept talking to me, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat. I didn't know how long I could stay hidden without being found. Then, suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I couldn't hear anything, not even the creak of the floor or the sound of breathing. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of the front door opening. My heart sank, thinking whoever it was had left. But then I heard voices, loud, authoritative voices. The police. I burst out of the pantry and ran to the front of the house. There were 2 officers standing in the foyer, flashlights in hand. They looked at me, surprised and relieved, as I rushed toward them, trying to explain what had happened. They told me to stay put while they went upstairs to check things out. I waited by the front door, my legs shaking so badly, I thought I might collapse. I listened as they went up the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the house. They called out, announcing themselves, but there was no response. A few minutes later, they came back down, telling me they didn't find anyone. They checked every room, every closet, but there was no sign of an intruder. The windows were all locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. It was like whoever or whatever I'd heard had vanished into thin air. The officers stayed with me while I called my parents to tell them what had happened. They said they would come home right away, but I didn't want to stay in the house alone for another second. I ended up going to a friend's place for the night, still shaken up by the whole thing. The police never found any evidence of someone being in the house that night. They chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe the house making noises, but I know what I heard. Those footsteps, the door opening, the feeling of being watched. It was real. I stayed with my friend until my parents got back. I never told them just how scared I was, not wanting them to worry. But for a long time after that, I had trouble being alone in the house. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't sleep without double-checking all the locks and windows. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there really was someone in the house. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I hope I never do again. Alright, so this happened to me a few years ago. I was living in this small apartment at the time. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. My roommates had gone out of town for the weekend, so I had the place all to myself. I remember feeling pretty excited about it, having some peace and quiet for once, you know? I had this whole plan in my head about how I was going to binge watch some Netflix series, order in a bunch of junk food, and just relax. Friday night came, and it was going pretty well. I ordered a pizza, watched a couple of episodes of some show I was into at the time, and just enjoyed the quiet. The apartment was in this old building, so it had that creaky, kind of spooky vibe, especially when it was just me there. But I was so caught up in the idea of having the place to myself that I didn't think much about it. It was around 11 p.m. when I decided to call it a night. I cleaned up a bit, made sure the front door was locked, and then headed to my room. As I was brushing my teeth, I thought I heard something, this faint noise coming from the living room. It was kind of like a tapping sound, but really light, almost like it could have been the wind or something. I paused and listened for a second, but it stopped. Figured it was nothing, maybe just the building settling or something like that. I went to bed, but I had this weird feeling. You know when you're just uneasy for no real reason? Like, nothing had actually happened, but I couldn't shake this sense that something wasn't right. I lay there for a while, just staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up to this loud thud. It was so sudden and unexpected that I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 2:30 a.m. The apartment was dead silent again, and I started to wonder if maybe I just dreamt the noise. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate creaking sound, like someone was walking down the hallway toward my room. I felt my stomach drop. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The creaking was soft, but I could hear it moving closer. I had no idea what to do. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe one of my roommates had come back early, or maybe it was just the building making noises. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The creaking had stopped right outside my door. I listened, straining my ears for any other sounds. Nothing, just the deafening silence of the apartment. I took a deep breath and reached over to grab my phone. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the door, half expecting to see the doorknob turning or something. But it was still. I waited for a few minutes just sitting there, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After a while, I decided I had to check it out. I couldn't just sit there all night, scared to death. I got up, slowly walked over to the door, and opened it a crack. I peeked out into the hallway, shining my phone's light around. It was empty. No one there. I opened the door wider and stepped into the hallway. My heart was still racing, but I forced myself to check the rest of the apartment. I went into the living room, the kitchen, even the bathroom. Everything was exactly how I'd left it. The front door was still locked, and there was no sign of anyone else in the apartment. I went back to my room, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. What the hell was that noise? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the building settling or something like that. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing little noises all night, every creak and groan of the apartment setting my nerves on edge. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I went about my day as usual, ran some errands, met up with a friend for lunch. By the time I got back to the apartment, it was already getting dark. I remember standing outside my front door, hesitating for a second before going in. I was almost afraid to go back inside, but I pushed the feeling down and opened the door. Everything was quiet when I got in. I tried to act normal, like everything was fine. I made myself some dinner, put on a movie, and tried to relax. But I couldn't shake this feeling that something was off. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing noises again. It was that same tapping sound from the night before. Faint at first, almost like it was coming from the walls. I paused the movie and listened. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like it was moving through the apartment. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked around the apartment, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't the windows or the doors. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, like someone, or something, was moving through them. I went back to the living room and stood there, listening. The tapping was right behind me now, coming from the wall by the couch. I turned around, half expecting to see something, but of course there was nothing there, just a blank wall. I don't know what came over me, but I walked up to the wall and put my ear against it. The tapping was right on the other side, so close it felt like it was almost in my head. I pulled back, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was losing my mind. I went back to my room, shutting the door behind me. I grabbed my phone and called one of my roommates, but of course they didn't answer. I left a shaky voicemail, telling them what was happening, trying not to sound as scared as I felt. I spent the rest of the night in my room, sitting on the bed with the lights on, listening to the tapping. It didn't stop. It just kept moving around the apartment, sometimes getting louder, sometimes quieter, but it was always there. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke up to my phone ringing. It was my roommate calling me back. I answered, trying to sound normal, but my voice was shaky. I told them about the noises, about how it felt like there was something inside the walls. They tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just the building settling or maybe a rat or something. I wanted to believe them, but I knew it wasn't that simple. They said they'd be back the next day, and I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. I just had to get through one more night alone in that apartment. The rest of the day went by in a blur. I tried to distract myself, but it was impossible to focus on anything. The apartment felt different now, like it wasn't really mine anymore, like something else had moved in. That night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. The tapping, louder this time, more urgent. It was coming from the hallway outside my room. I sat up, my heart pounding. I listened, frozen with fear. The tapping turned into scratching, like something was trying to claw its way through the walls. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the door. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then it stopped. For a second, everything was silent. And then, the doorknob started to turn. I felt like my heart was going to explode out of my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just sat there, watching the doorknob slowly turn. It turned all the way, and then, nothing. The door didn't open. The scratching started again, this time right outside my door, so loud I could feel it in my bones. I don't know how long I sat there, listening, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The scratching went on for what felt like hours, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to move or even blink. When the first light of dawn finally started to filter through the window, I felt this huge sense of relief. I got up, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of the apartment. I didn't even bother to pack a bag. I just left. I spent the day at a friend's place, waiting for my roommates to come back. When they did, I went back to the apartment with them, but everything was normal again. The noises were gone, the tapping, the scratching. It was like it had never happened. I never told my roommates the full story. I didn't want them to think I was crazy, but I've never felt the same about that apartment since. Even now, whenever I'm alone in there, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not really alone. Like something's watching me, waiting. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the building settling, or maybe it was something else. All I know is that I've never been so scared in my life. And whenever I think about that weekend, I get this cold, creeping feeling in my gut, like whatever it was might come back.